Hi, this is Paul. On Friday, I released part 2 of my commentary on the Vervaeke-Peterson conversation. Now, part of what I'm doing is using using a combination of Substack and Twitter to write video summaries. Now, not everyone has hours to sit and watch, or there's always an audio-only podcast version of the videos as well. So often what I do, and this is sort of part of the practice of thinking through these videos, is I will release a video that morning, and then I want to release a link to that video on Twitter, and I want to give some sense of what's in the video. But just as, a lot of people say, well, can't you just condense this? I just don't have time to do a clip channel right now. But can't you just condense this? And it's like, no. Peterson had a nice line in there about, in the conversation that he's given before, the difference between just sort of a revelatory download, let's say, and editing. And these first draft videos are just mind dumps, brain dumps through YouTube. And I'm recording them so that I have them. And as I said, on the quest every Friday, probably won't do one next week, but many Fridays I have a question and answer session on the Bridges of Meaning Discord. And often by the end of the video, I've got some different ideas about the video than when I started. That's why I do what I do, and it's why these things take so long. And I completely understand when people say, I don't have time to watch or listen to that thing. It's totally get that. Totally get that. So because of that, I have taken up this Substack where I sort of create these tweets, and the tweets force me to sort of get the ideas within 280 characters. So bang, 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 bang. Twitter is nice because it does a nice job with links, as does Substack. I can just basically take that tweet thread, throw it onto Substack, and be done. There are sometimes typos which are significant, as there was in this one, which I'll point out when I get to the end of it. So if you sort of want to keep up with what I'm doing on my commentaries and monologues, just subscribe to my Substack. I haven't monetized the Substack at all. I don't know if I'll do that at some point, if it grows large enough, perhaps, or if I need money for something, perhaps. But at this point, it's all free, so you get them all if you want to. And so I entitled this one, The Fall of Modernity and the Rise of Spirit, because as usually what happens is I'll make the commentary video the day before or a few days before, and then I'll get up early in the morning and I'll do the Twitter work and write the Substack. And usually there's been development while I sleep, and things have sort of crystallized. And so not only is the Substack a summary of the video, but the Substack is usually an ongoing processing of some of the ideas that making the video has provoked in me. So the title of the Substack is The Fall of Modernity and the Rise of Spirit, Dissecting the Jordan Peterson-John Vervaeke Conversation. Today's video is the second release of the commentary on Jordan Peterson conversation with John Vervaeke. And you'll notice in the Substack that it's almost always the Twitter handles, if they have one, of these individuals, because this starts as a tweet. And of course, part 2 was entitled John Vervaeke's Distributed Cognition into Jordan Peterson's Spirit. When this video first dropped on Monday, meaning the original, the reaction of many of us was, what was that? There was no consensus on how to account for this unusual conversation. The title calls it psychedelic. I think of it's more shamanic, and I talk about that. What do I mean by shamanic? Because having a Christian minister talk about something being shamanic, something, again, if you listen to some of the early episodes of John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, shamanic is sort of a breakup of sense-making so that you can see alternative perspectives of whatever it is you're looking at. A key theme that I've been developing for a while in my videos is that the disruptions of what Rebel Wisdom calls sense-making is the cause for a lot of the societal, political, and ecclesiastical chaos and disruption. Modernity was able to achieve broad consensus in many areas through mass media where the propagandistic elements were so pervasive it couldn't be seen. It would be best seen if it were part of a sufficiently coherent ethnic, political, or religious subculture. For example, if you were a fundamentalist, increasingly you look at broader American society and you say, that's no longer me. That began to break down in the political sphere with the coming of Fox News. And if you remember, all the way back when I first started making videos about Jordan Peterson, I was reading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And Neil Postman wrote that book with the rise of cable TV. And since that time, things have exploded exponentially. Then there were two bubbles who were just delivering propagandistic facts. The internet plus the rise of social media platforms made everyone look like a propagandist except me and my little tribe. Modernity invites the individual to imagine himself or herself above a world of objects or a world of facts that they directly observe and pass judgment on. In many ways, Descartes got this thing going with his invitation to strip away everything from the subject, even making thinking something differentiated from the self. John Vervaeke is asserting that this Cartesian way of knowing is increasingly undermined by cognitive science. And then I have a link to where he talks about that. In order to mentally grasp an object, the subject doesn't simply stand apart, but must conform itself to the object as the hand conforms to grasp the cup. In order to know the subject, one must to a degree participate in the object. There's something I should correct in the Substack a moment. In order to know the subject, one must to a degree participate in the object. Distributed cognition has a property, collective intelligence, that is not just the sum of individual intelligences, John Vervaeke asserts here, and then the link to it. In a monofocal propagandistic modernity, sense-making, this dynamic is masked. We participate in the vast sense-making stories naively, taking them in deeply, deriving our identities from them. As the mass media grip on the zeitgeist was increasingly disrupted first by cable TV and then by internet consensus within the body, politics continues to break down. Awareness, especially during the Trump campaign, arose with fake news and the loss of facts. This process happened long ago in the Western Church with the Protestant Reformation, fueled by the rise of the printing press. Western churches adopted mass media techniques to keep their collective cognition whole, in addition to historic Christian communal sense-making. The current bipartisan political desire to rein in social media is an attempt by modernistic mass media to recapture their lost world, but it will fail. Technology has killed modernity in a similar way that it killed the medieval Roman Church. And it didn't kill the Roman Church. Of course, the Protestant Church arose, and I talked about in my question and answer today about Protestantism being sort of the laboratory of change for the church as a whole. But the medieval Roman Church gave way to the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent, which brought about the modern Roman Catholic Church. And you can read about that in the book out recently, Reformations, by I forget his name. What we find beneath the rubble of modernity is a far older way of talking which will not be unfamiliar to Christians who didn't completely translate away their Bibles, that of spirit. What Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke are doing in this conversation is the unmasking of spirit beneath the rubble of modernity. John Vervaeke's non-theistic project of developing a religion that's not a religion within an ecology of practices has discovered that logos emerges as people intentionally pursue some form of distributed cognition. Jordan Peterson keeps trying to map John's observations onto his psychological reading of Christianity. I believe part of the reason Jordan Peterson triggered a sacramental Christian religious revival is that he's been unmasking spirit in the modern frame. Jonathan Peugeot has been doing similarly, but with the non-confrontative exposure of pattern as an accessible static metaphor for spirit. Ancients would of course find all of this to be most obvious. Spirit has always been the word used to account for the movement of individuals and groups. It was just discarded in the naturalism lab leak that shamed people out of that way of talking. Instead of dreading dissecting this shamanistic conversation, originally it said not in the tweet, and that was a misspelling or a typo, now motivated to continue into it. I hope these explanations will make it more accessible. And then a couple of really good comments left, first by Kim Watson. Paul, I too am only 30 minutes into the Peterson Vervaeke and have started your commentary first, but stopped when I saw you felt confused and bothered. I wanted to see the original for myself before seeing your take, which is what I usually do. As an aside, I'm a Star Trek fan who loved Enterprise on its first run because I stayed away from negative commentary that could influence me. I have a history with this, laugh out loud. Only 30 minutes in, while Jordan's interruptions have been a bit bothersome, I have two observations. There's a give and take between them that is a far more casual conversation among peers than either one's usual MO. They speak the same language easily and have clearly, I'm not so sure about that, because Vervaekean language is pretty strict, and have clearly had some conversations over the years to know how the other one reacts, overreacts, interacts. There are asides, jokes, and personal knowledge coming out of this that make it more of an eavesdropping than an interview. I think that's true. We're all flies on the YouTube wall with this. I think that's true. As someone with ADHD over 50 years, this begins to sound like what goes on in my monkey mind, which is usually treated as negative. In this case, though, it's as if each person is a side of the brain. John takes the part of the left brain with reasoning, logic, details. Jordan takes the right side with intuition, imagination, creativity, order, and chaos, the center and the edge. These interjections and interruptions are more normal to me as I think than as I speak or listen. I think that's true. As Jordan has said many times, you have to speak in order to think. In the beginning, he's blurting out his speaking part as he tries to think with John's left brain. And they each actually know exactly what the other is talking about when we have no idea. I'm not sure that's always true in this video. I'm really excited to see what all comes out of this as it spirals out into our little corner of the world. This conversation is fascinating. I agree. And James Lee, we all belong to cults. The cult you cannot see is the one you belong to. It's a great line. Paraphrasing overseas journalist Michael Yan. Thank you, Paul. I think, and he's quite right on this, I think you mean are motivated or now motivated to continue diving into this conversation. I appreciate now having your Substack to digest your thoughts along with gathering up snippets of your video commentary, although they are edifying immensely. I am about halfway through the John Vervaeke, Jordan Peterson conversation and 30 minutes through your commentary. Normally, I try to listen to podcasts at 1.5x to get more information in, but had to slow theirs down to one time. Many people have made this comment, even to attempt to follow them. You frame the language that seems to be Jordan Peterson as manic or schizophrenic in the lay sense of the terms, and I found it annoying that he keeps interrupting Vervaeke. As you say, is Jordan Peterson all right? That question is still out there. Still, if John Vervaeke, still a member of the Blue Church in good standing, Vervaeke's, I think, always sort of been a heretic in the Blue Church. Vervaeke and the Blue Church, I'm going to have to think a lot more about that because John has always been a fringe individual for the Blue Church, tolerated. He's not an iconoclast in the Blue Church, sort of like Peterson. Peterson is in some ways a rebel I think Peterson is in some ways a rebel who wants to purify the blue church. And in that way, he's sort of one of my first conversations with Ron Dart was about Erasmus and Luther. And Dart wanted to see Peterson as Erasmus, and I said, no, he's way more Luther. Jordan wants to purify the blue church. John is sort of like a member of a church who knows exactly where not to step to get in trouble with the blue church, but is in other ways a quiet revolutionary of his own, but in good standing with the blue church, as James says. Although he wasted his time or was offended by Jordan Peterson, how come he consented to having the video released? Or am I mistaken and John Vervaeke is embarrassed to be party in this insane conversation? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think one of the amazing qualities I've noticed about John Vervaeke is how he can roll with a lot of divergent people, including myself, because for Vervaeke to talk to an established Christian minister by myself, both John Vervaeke and I take hits for talking to each other, which is part of what makes it fun. Fascinating. I continue to find meaning following you on this path online and in person. Regards, sir. I've got to get back to my day job. James is a part of our local meetup here. So again, if you don't have time to watch all the videos, you can just subscribe to the Substack, and at least you'll get a sense of where I'm going, what I'm thinking in a far briefer way. Twitter, there's a lot more noise to signal. I play around with Twitter a lot. But the Substack will be quite a bit more disciplined and quite a bit more brief than other things. So you'll find a link to the Substack below, and if you subscribe, it'll come to your email box. Now, we're ready to dive back in. I got some complaints, and sound levels with these commentaries is always tricky. Things have gotten quite a bit better since I started using OBS, and the comment on the last one was my voice was it didn't say it, but then I did a little investigating. My voice volume was a little lower than the commentary volume, so I lowered the commentary volume a little bit. Hopefully it won't be too much. It is a little tricky. Now, someone who say, well, you can edit these and normalize the sound. Yes, but then I have to edit these. And if you understand the nature of this project for me, I don't really consider myself a YouTube creator. That's the YouTube term that they like to use. I am using this way of creating a learning community and educating myself, and these commentary videos are completely unedited. I don't edit these videos at all. And a lot of the process that I've developed, it's sort of a streaming process, even though I don't stream them, so that I don't edit. Because if I had to edit video, I wouldn't have a channel, because I don't want to edit. I don't want to edit. So let's go.
You're looking for.
Well, I think you probably lost me to some degree with that last move. So maybe I can get you to lay it out a bit more.
So what people start to do is, in relationship to the way the Logos is unfolding, they start to see a pattern of how things can unfold and make sense. And then they start to see that maybe that's the pattern that is ultimately discloses reality to them. That's how.
Now, there was a lot of discussion in the comments on my last video about Logos in this way. And my comments at the end of it was, they both want to be talking about one thing. And I think from a Christian perspective, there isn't just one thing. That if you, let's say you have how can I say this? So for a Christian, spirits, there are lots of spirits around. And you can understand this in sort of a revelatory, traditional religious way that posits spirits that are not created by human beings And there are spirits that are created by us. And many spirits are collaborative between non-human spirits and human spirits. Okay? So let's use my go-to illustration of school spirit. Let's imagine that a high school was built on let's say that the developers of the town chose a site for the planned school on an outcropping to afford it wonderful views. The climate of where that school is located will impact school spirit. The architecture, which is a function of the geology and the geography of the school, will impact school spirit. And so now you have spiritual influences that are a function of the geography and the geology. And so you'll have spiritual influences that are already embedded before human beings were ever around in this world. Now again, in a Christian worldview, there are spiritual powers and forces that are pre-human. And this is where the question of spirit and non-human spirits and even what we would call aliens comes into fore, because we are awash in spirits. We are sensitive to spirit, and we participate in spirits, and we contribute to spirits. And so in this conversation where they keep focusing in on logos, and that's a valid thing to do, I would continue to say that, let's say if you have a group that is circling or a group that is meditating together, and these are practices that John has been studying and working in. Jordan Peterson has been paying more attention to historical spirits, that to use the singular is okay, but it is also insufficient. Now, this is very tricky because, the videos that I'm not making, where I'm thinking about things like universal history, and where I'm thinking about the past. See, the past is a very tricky thing, because not only, let's say, something physical in the past, like Jesus' revelation, or a car accident that I had in the year 2000, January of 2000, when I was leaving the Myers parking lot in Grand Rapids, Michigan, moving into 28th Street on the suicide lane, right at the intersection of Kalamazoo Avenue and 28th Street. And I moved in, and I didn't see a car that was coming down because it was masked by another car, and it hit my little blue car. And then my wife's uncle, who worked at a body shop, gave us a good deal in repairing the car. That was an incident that happened at a place in time. That incident, its physicality doesn't change, but via history, that incident has many, many layers of reality built into that incident. The make of the car, the history of the creation of that car. You have combinatorial explosion in that incident. And multiple spirits are in that incident. Yet, see, this gets into the question of what religion was, and especially, let's say, the book of Job. Because Job's friends say, because of the calamities that you have suffered, you have offended God. Pagans might say you have offended the gods in their attempt to deal with the agent-arena relationship and the metadivine realm. They might have said it was fated. I've just about completed The Last Kingdom and Uhtred and that whole story on Netflix, season 4. And Uhtred keeps saying things like, everything is fate. And again, fate is an attempt to agentify the arenic, impersonal nature of this metadivine realm. And there have been endless religious conversations with respect to that. So they're talking about logos in the Platonic sense, and the Neoplatonic sense, and the Stoic sense is this organizing principle. But again, when you get to this level, agency and arenic agency get very interesting. And so they keep talking about the singular, and in this sense, they keep looking for what Jordan Peterson might call God. And John Vervaeke, a non-theist, well, in some ways, even though for Jordan Peterson, God is something that I might put in quotes, very early in the biblical lectures, somebody asked Jordan, I should look up his answer to that and listen to that again. Someone asked Jordan, if all of human minds were to go away, would God go away? And that was a very profound and subtle question, because Jordan Peterson, in a modernist frame, when he's speaking psychologically, God is a function of the intersubjective between us in many ways. And so I dealt with a question about that in today's question and answer. God then is a function of what we need to make sense of the world. And I think Jordan Peterson is right that God is just too helpful of, that God, in quotes, is too helpful of a function to actually do away with. And so there's no killing that God, because we simply need that God for us to make sense of the world. But to what degree, ontologically, is that God an agent who has purpose? Very interesting. That was with Ginger Bill. When Ginger Bill said, about the real difference between us and animals, my conversation last Friday with Ginger Bill, is our capacity for purpose. And of course, if you're, as John Vervaeke, have questions about telos and say, well, this is something that people do and it's not in the universe, well, that's sort of the assertion of contemporary non-reductive naturalism. And I think, J.P. Marceau has really worked hard on John Vervaeke's conceptions of that. That's the debate. And to what degree then are Christians fooling themselves? Again, a lot of these questions came up in my question and answers today, and I thought today's was a particularly good question and answer. They're quite uneven, but I thought they were pretty good. So again, all of this to the fact that they're talking about the singular logos and not various spirits, because I would say when a group of people come together, all of the combinatorial explosive data comes together in that group, and in a sense, they create a new spirit. That might be a very short-living spirit. Today, in sort of the new agey lingo, they might talk about the energy of the group. And so I guess in some ways, energy has become a word that we are substituting for spirit, again, because of the naturalistic lab leak and social pressure. We don't want to say that word, even though the word hasn't been completely exorcised from our vocabulary. And so when we listen to a group talk about the energy in the room or the energy of the group, that is, in a sense, a spirit that all of these spiritual beings in the room have come together to create or participate in, because there's probably some energy from the architecture, energy from the history of the room, energy that's all there. I would say spirit that's all there, that is going to impact the spirit that the group creates by their gathering. Now, can you follow that all the way back to the logos that created the world? Yes. That logos is never exercised completely. The only place where that logos is completely exercised, we have a name for, and that name is hell, which is by definition the complete extraction of the logos in sort of a C.S. Lewis Great Divorce way of saying, I won't bother you anymore. But what in fact is left of you if it goes that far? So I know that's a lot to say, and if I keep going like this, we're 25 minutes into 2.5 hours. So yeah, maybe maybe someone will win the bet over someone else.
They start to think.
Well, that's okay. So is that akin? This is why you're so interested in consciousness. I mean, I think maybe one of the things you and I share is that we find it difficult to make a distinction between the consciousness of reality and reality itself.
So I think, yeah, I mean, that's why I've coined this term transjective, to try and talk about the relationship, these kinds of relationships of participation, that they're being co-created by reality.
Transjective. Okay, so yeah. Expound upon that.
See, and this is why I think, again, Peterson's been, okay, someone took issue with me saying he's fighting for his life. Okay, he's been busy, okay? If you don't like fighting for his life, he's been busy.
Well, the notion is ultimately derived from Tillich's idea of the symbol as that which grounds and makes possible the relationship between the subjective and the objective.
And I think this point here, and part of the bigger project of trying to account for the Christian Jordan Peterson revival and the shape that that revival has, is why Neo-sacramentalism. And I think Vervaeke puts his finger on it here, that looking for these sacramental portals between us and our Maker, and us and the world of, I'll use Christian terms, the Holy Spirit, is something that has, is deeply undermined by, to a certain degree, by Protestantism. And you can read Peter Kreeft's book on dialogue between C.S. Lewis and Billy Graham, and who was the third person that he put in? Billy Graham, C.S. Lewis, and probably, I've got it in Kindle, can't think of it right now. But it was about sacrament, about, again, what I've been, when I talked to Brett Sockold about transubstantiation. That's why this, I think, Peterson triggered, so deeply strange, but Peterson triggered this revival of neo-sacramentalism, which in some ways was sort of just, it's been already swelling up. I see that because churches that we planted in the 90s that were seeker-oriented have all gone neo-sacramental. And when I told the church in Australia, when I told the pastor, your wave is coming, my friend, because I know you're living in, you're living in the land of Hillsong, but your day is coming. And he's like, I don't see it. I said, yeah, but culture moves from California to Australia.
It would be the kind of idea that you have in ancient epistemology, whereas instead of thinking of knowledge as representing something over there, Aristotle's idea is the mind and the object that is known come into conformity.
Now, this is what I wrote about in the Substack, and I realized when I was writing it that I was smuggling in a little bit of the future into that, because I had exactly this scene in mind in the Substack. And again, because yesterday, every now and then when I make these videos, I fail to pay attention to whether or not the record button is on, and this has to do with the various setup I have here in terms of especially the space bar, and stopping these videos. Sometimes I stop the recording and I don't realize I'm stopping the recording, and then I sit here and talk for an hour or 45 minutes and have nothing to show for it, except of course the process. And so you've got the secondary benefit of that, because I had seen this and talked about this already. But this point I think is really critical, and I think John Vervaeke is right that what we are realizing is that the modernist epistemology We're done with it. It's not. It's going away, and this is a big part of modernity going away.
Using is the of knowledge as representing something over there. And, you know, Aristotle's idea is the mind and the object that is known come into conformity. I'm using shape as a metaphor for form, where form means something more like, you know, a Platonic form, the structural functional organization that makes it be what it is. This is the key Greek idea. That which makes it be what it is also what makes it be knowable as it is.
Right there. That is so key. Now, again, many people who will watch this conversation have not listened to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And John goes through that stuff. And I've listened to those videos, not all of them, but many of them 2 or 3 times. But this already was before COVID when he was making them. That point right there is key, and I think it's correct. And this is part of the reason there's such an ancient element to this, and part of the reason that Jonathan Pageau is finding so much purchase with the culture, because I think he's right. And there's a deep strain of Aristotle in Pageau's work.
Greek structural functional organization that makes it be what it is. This is the key Greek idea. That which makes it be what it is also what makes it be knowable as it is. And so I'm not representing the cup. My mind conforms to it. It has this.
See, and that's the difference, because with a monarchical vision in the modern frame, we think, oh, there's a cup, I know it. And now, because of cognitive science, we realize that in some ways, we have to bring that cup into our space. And if you watch yourself closely, and I became aware of this stuff watching the Peterson videos, if you watch yourself closely, you know, where is the book in my study? I can point to the area that it's at. Well, that's weird, because my books are not terribly organized, in case you didn't notice. But I yet have a sense of where it is. I have a member in my church who is a brilliant man, and he's getting up there in age now, but he's been a absolutely central figure in a particular state department. He famously had in his office huge stacks of papers that covered the floor. And, you know, it's almost a party trick. Someone would go to his office. I mean, the guy's just a savant. He really is. People would go to his office and ask for a paper, and he would look at the stacks, and he would be able to zero in where in the stack and pull it out. People, how can he do that? Well, he couldn't tell you where the paper was. In a sense, it was physically he and his office was in his mind. And that's true of here. Again and again, every now and then, my wife will move something in the kitchen. And it's so bad because I'm so much my father in this, because my mother would laugh because my father would try to put something away in the place that it used to be 10 years before. And my mother would get frustrated and say, why couldn't you learn that I moved this? And I do the same things every now and then, especially when I'm thinking about something else. I automatically go to pull out a dish from a cupboard where the dishes used to be. That got imprinted in me. And so in some sense, my kitchen physically is in my mind, and it's not stored in the way we imagine things are stored. And I think what the point he is making here is dead on right.
The same form as it. And so it's not right to say that it's sort of...
Well, that's what you do when you reach to pick up the cup, according to Piaget.
Well, yes, very much.
And so in some sense, you're mimicking the cup by understanding it.
You're shaping yourself to it, right?
Yes.
Which is different. So, and this is the difference between a Cartesian and a theological approach to knowledge, right? Because the Cartesian approach is, I don't have to undergo transformation in fundamentally in who I am in order to know. I just have to properly organize my proposition.
Okay. And here's where we get to Protestantism. Because Protestantism, so if you're a medieval Catholic, how are you saved? By going to Mass, by confessing to the priest, by baptism, by last rites, by the sacrament. Protestantism changed this. How are you saved? By knowing the propositions. Now, there's a pitfall here, and this is where I expose my Protestant self once again, because that propositionalism doesn't go away. It's always there, and what we're really dealing with is emphasis. Because even in Protestantism, in some extreme forms of Protestantism, they do away with the sacraments. And this is where, again, Peter Kreeft's book about Lewis, oh gosh, who was the third one? Was it Tolkien? Tolkien, Lewis, and Billy Graham talking about the sacraments. This is this issue, okay? And so now this critique of propositionalism, which is right there in how many deconstruction stories, which is there in Peterson, which is there in Vervaeke. This is a reassessment of modernity. And now what we usually do when we reassess or when we destroy the icons of something is we overreach. So it's always what revolutions do. They always overreach. And then after the enthusiasm of the overreaching, it's, well, maybe I went too far. Usually we do. But notice here, this is where the lines are. And now in this video, for the first time, Vervaeke is going to talk to Peterson about... My wife just messaged me. Hang on. This is a very difficult video to sort of summarize by its frenetic quality. And you can even see, YouTube has all of these little, this is a new feature that YouTube put in. Look how many of them there are in this conversation. Compare that to some of his previous conversations. Now, John communicating his 4 Ps of knowledge is, I think, one of the successes of this video, because his 4 Ps, it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 3 and 1. Not 3 in 1, but 3 and 1. That is key to understanding this. And if you've watched my previous videos, you know that I often bring up John's 4 Ps. And of course, some in the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server have argued that it should be parabolic. And so there's a lot of debate about those 4 Ps, but we're just going to go with John's 4 Ps because John's got the bigger platform and more of you can sort of be conversant with it.
Positions. But if you go before to know, I just have to properly organize my propositions. But if you go before Descartes, right, even reading was pursued not informatively, but transformatively. The idea was, unless I go through fundamental transformations, there are deep truths that will not be disclosed to me.
And see, this is where, Calvin is such an interesting figure. Calvinist would bring up John Calvin, because this is part of what Calvin says about the work of the Holy Spirit in the Christian's life. You have to know Christ in order to understand him. Now, a lot of people don't realize that Calvin loved the church fathers and read them deeply. Now, part of what happened after Calvin is that Calvinists in the following generation, because remember, Calvinists, a lot of these reformational pastors were Renaissance people. What do I mean by that? They loved the classics. And so this was part of the Italian Renaissance and Renaissance humanism, where you can read this again in Reformations. They took on Greek names and they took on Latin. They took on ancient names because they were such fanboys of the classical world. And so some of Calvin's ideas about what it means to know God, Vervaeke is talking here. This isn't alien. It just tended to be people a century later. Nobody in the 16th century called themselves a Calvinist. In the 17th century, they would. No one in the 16th century would call themselves a Lutheran. In the 17th century, they would, because Calvin and Luther would have been horrified at people using their names, just like in some ways Paul was horrified that the church at Corinth said, I follow Apollo, I follow Cephas, I follow Paul. Paul says, no, we all follow Christ. So these ideas, if you look at, they're still there in the Reformation, but as the Reformation progressed, they tended to drop out as modernity really gets going, especially in what is the Enlightenment, which is post-Reformational.
That's a conformity theory of knowing as opposed to a representational theory of knowing. And what happens, what I'm saying is people, they feel themselves being conformed to reality through the logos.
And Romans 12 pops to mind. Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, the Apostle Paul says in Romans 12. What does he mean by that? Now there's the Spirit enables a new way of seeing the world. You'll look through the world differently. And I love this pause here that Peterson gives. And it's rather dramatic because of all of the interruptions. And now Peterson pauses to really think this through.
So that's a feeling of personal transformation? Is that the feeling of is that same feeling of tracking? Is that the same as stumbling uphill with your cross towards the city of God?
See, they're trying to find each other here. And of course, Peterson is basically using his psychological take of Christianity as a platform to interpret it. And of course, Vervaeke with his non-theism, and that was the conversation I expected them to have, is Vervaeke's critique of hero mythology, of telotic narratives, and well, maybe they'll get to that at some point, because John is well versed in Peterson's thinking and has his critique. But at this meeting, I think they're just getting to know each other again.
Well, maybe that's why I asked the question.
Well, let me try.
I don't know either. Okay. So, I mean, this is some metaphor that pops into my mind all the time. Yeah. You know, we're shouldering this burden. What is the burden? Well, for you, you said it's transformative consciousness, or I think that's what you said. And we stumble uphill with it towards what?
So, everybody pays attention to when they name dropped me earlier in the video. This is the moment I pay attention to, and let me show you why.
So, got a couple of minutes left, so this might be quite a big question. But just come back from the US where we interviewed Paul Vanderklay, a Christian pastor who's been doing quite a lot of videos about your thought.
I had only begun to do videos.
One of his questions was, he says he sees a real sort of stoicism in your thought. So pick up your cross and drag it up the hill. His question is, what's at the top of the hill? He doesn't hear that. God.
Well, that's because he hasn't listened to the times when I've been talking about it, I guess, because I've said it repeatedly. You stumble uphill with your burden towards the city of God. That's the story.
And what does that mean, the city of God, to you?
I would say that's a place where everyone bears maximal responsibility and speaks the truth.
It's stoicism.
That's what it is. And what's the responsibility? You're responsible for the suffering in the world. You're responsible for the malevolence in the world. And you're responsible for the veracity of your utterances. Right. And in the city of God, you're maximally responsible for the suffering. You're maximally responsible for the malevolence. And you speak the truth. That's what it is.
See, and, doing a lot of deconstructing of wokeism, wokeism is you're maximally responsible for the suffering of the world. And there's no grace. There's no forgiveness. The breakthrough, especially as a Protestant, as a Calvinist, of Christianity is the grace. Because in this world of locked in guilt, condemnation, damnation, consequences, this trail of tears of 10,000 years for humanity. We opened the question and answer today with the question about the orange shirts and the toppling of a statue of a sitting queen at the Parliament in Manitoba, and the government in Canada allowing this to happen. It's like, did you forget what a government is or how it works? Apparently so. Yes, you have. And how all of these things happen. Now, to understand that human beings wrong and hurt and kill, and they do so consistently, and they often do so in the name of righteousness. Remember, Jesus was killed in the name of righteousness. The Apostle Paul persecuted the church in the name of righteousness. This is what we do. The miracle isn't responsibility. You don't need a miracle to see that. The miracle is forgiveness. That's what you need revelation for. And so I'm not interested in dragging something heavy up the hill just to hear I'm responsible. I'm going to go up that hill to see the redemption of my soul and a new heavens and a new earth. That's why I'm heading up that hill. And I'll drag a heavy cross. But it's grace. That's the miracle, not responsibility or guilt. That's everywhere.
Well, let me try. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Well,
I spent a lot of time thinking it up.
He's been thinking about this a lot. That's right.
Well, for me, so one of the things, and this is again for me from the Socratic tradition, this kind of knowing that we're talking about, this kind of transformational knowing, there's no clean separation from you knowing the thing and you knowing yourself.
Do you think there's a clear separation from the insight experience, or is that the same thing?
I think the insight experience is exactly that kind of thing in small doses. And then when you start to link them together, you can get flow experiences. And what happens in flow experiences...
Yeah, and if you link them together too much, it's nonstop flow experience. And then the question is, can you tolerate it?
Well, that's another, I mean, that's a good question.
There's another question. Maybe we can get to that. I'm not sure I can tolerate it.
Well,
I mean, I just sometimes in listening to this video have to slow it down. And if you haven't watched the Bridges of Meaning News episode 4, where the masked newscaster slows down elements of this conversation, you should see it. It's hilarious. If I don't put the link in the notes, Chad, drop it in the comment section.
There's the possibility, and this comes from my experience, my decades experience as a Taoist Tai Chi player. I mean, Csikszentmihalyi largely talks about what you might call hot flow, and Now
him calling himself a player is very intentional. And if you watch Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, he explains why he's not a, and there's a good reason for that, and it's really good language. And I could say I'm a Christianity player by the definition of what player is for him. And again, this is part of the difficulty of understanding Vervaeke, because he's worked on this stuff for so long, and he's got, Peterson prides himself on accurate speech. Vervaeke does too. That's a function of academia, to get the language right.
The player. I mean, Csikszentmihalyi largely talks about what you might call hot flow, and the flow that you experience, the flow you experience when there's a lot of metabolic expenditure. But you can get into the flow state when you're doing Tai Chi Chuan, and you're not doing a tremendous kind of, at least physiological. I imagine there's stuff going on cognitively, but you don't have that same sense of I'm going to burn out. You have this
No,
different
well, I
sense.
need some of that because I have that sense of I must be in a hot state of flow then all the time.
But the
I mean, that's. I mean, there's a lot of comments like this about that. I mean, he's got to be suffering. What? I mean, he's said many times he's suffering, but and I watch him like this, and I want to tell him about grace. If what awaits you at the top of the hill after carrying that cross is the maximal sense of your own responsibility, it will crush you. This is what Peugeot told him. Misery, deliverance, gratitude. Jesus was on the cross. We're to take up our crosses too. Absolutely. But he does the lifting. And the church is a shelter. And I understand how people look at that and say it's a dodge. If Christianity were simply a dodge, you wouldn't have people leaving the church saying it's too much work. But it's a different kind of work because it's a work of grace. It's a work of gratitude. Misery, deliverance, gratitude. Misery, deliverance, gratitude. Make that into a meme. Misery, deliverance, gratitude. Misery, deliverance, gratitude.
The thing about the good state of flow is that it opens up the possibility for you to you have more time to explore that participatory sense. So like Csikszentmihalyi says, you're in the flow state, you have the sense of at-one-ment, right? That powerful, that's one of the defining features. And
Atonement.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is where, so you have a sense of meaning, or this is where I did a little conversation, a little live stream yesterday, and I brought up The Abolition of Man, because that book is rather central, because when Lewis talks about Coleridge and the waterfall is pretty or the waterfall is sublime, is a flow state in some ways sacramental as a portal into a world of spirit. So atonement, in my catechesis as a young boy in the Christian Reformed Church, atonement is at-one-ment. We are reconciled with Christ by virtue of his sacrifice on the cross. And, as part of our tradition, we are often warned about works righteousness. And again, this is very much a reformational take on Paul. And there's a lot of nuance that you can say, and you can look at N.T. Wright's work and a lot of the recent Pauline work on this. But what the Calvinist posture emphasizes is giftness. That to the degree that we are afforded entrance into the Spirit is a gift from God. And again, God number one and God number two. The arena and agent working together.
Exactly, right? And you have...
And so what do you think that means? Because that pulls original sin into it.
Well, or the other way around, or original sin made use of the idea of at-one-ment that is originally...
Yeah, as the
Original sin or original guilt? Does that always comes... Because original sin, when people use original sin, I find they tend to use it in a rather sloppy way. Original sin as a sense of we are already born with a debt, or as a sense of because Adam because Adam sinned, we all sin. I mean, actually, in my systematics class with Neil Plantinga, we took a couple of days on this where he got into Berkouwer, who's another Dutch theologian, because some of the distinctions involved here are really important. And so often when I hear original sin just sort of lightly used out there, I don't know what sense they're meaning it in when they're using it.
As the antidote, as the stuff of the Grail, as atonement. But that's the city on the hill too.
It is. I mean, if we're...
Or it's the wandering up to the city on the hill. That's the other possibility, or another possibility.
You've got I've got John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress going through me. I've got Augustine's City of God. I'm trying to parse them.
That's a tough road to hoe there, John.
What I was saying is, I think that when you're doing this kind, like when you can get into a more of a cool flow, rather than a hot flow.
Teach me.
Well, I'd love to. That'd be great. What I've noticed, and I see this also happening in, this. One way of thinking of what we're talking about when we're talking about like these circling practices and these dialoga practices is you're getting shared flow. You're getting flow in distributed cognition.
Definitely.
Yeah. And
I'm
then
hoping that's what I'm inducing in my listeners on YouTube, and I think it happened with John, with my Carver friend,
Jonathan Pajot.
Jonathan, yeah.
Well, part of what I noted again, we could look at how my interaction with this work has sort of followed the waves, because what happened when I started speaking about Peterson, I just got a tremendous number of requests for time, for conversation, and as I began to reflect and gain perspective on those, I discovered that especially the biblical series was relieving people I was talking to of nihilistic depression, and which is very connected to Vervaeke's meaning crisis. And I thought, what a thing that somehow, because Peterson very much would be in a state of flow in those biblical series, just watching him and participating in that state of flow would be enough to give people a sense of relief from their nihilistic depression because of the meaning crisis. And part of the reason I threw myself into this and worked my channel in such a way that I could be found by people in this state was I knew just repeatedly watching the biblical series was not going to be enough. They were going to need groups of people to talk with. Now, I mentioned before, I spent 4 hours on Thursday with 2 of the estuary host support groups, basically leadership training for estuary leaders. And I think probably in the next month or so, or next couple of months, we'll be unveiling what maybe we'll call the estuary protocol. So that these Jordan Peterson meetups that we originally started 3 years ago, I'm going to transition mine into an estuary group. And whereas I had a protocol that I used for the Jordan Peterson meetups, now I'm going to be doing much more as an estuary, where we're going to have this kind of conversation together. And as I said to the question and answer today, and as I said to the estuary support groups, I think these groups will likely be downstream from churches, which is part of the definition of estuary, but they have to be distant from churches. And what I intentionally don't do is overt proselytization. If people want to swim upstream, that's fine. And swimming upstream is sort of like carrying that cross up a hill. And that's what, being a catechumen, why am I using that? ancient church language, if that's what training and discipleship, now I'm using evangelical language, but if, many will want to swim upstream. And of course, as a Christian minister, that's what I welcome. In some ways, your discipleship group is your fish ladder. So, but, people can swim back out to the ocean. That's fine too. So,
yes.
Yeah.
And that was a very peculiar podcast, and I thought it did that, and this one will too.
Well, that's the thing.
Okay. Point for Peterson intentionality in this crazy video. Right there. There's a point for that. That he is intentionally pursuing a shamanic, psychedelic, in his words, encounter. So we'll see.
The thing is, and
look, it got 1.5 million views. Like, what the hell's going on?
Because I think Jonathan is.
I don't know that this one will. Not in the same time span Peugeot's did. Just because so many people listened to 20 minutes of it and said, I can't listen to this. This is unlistenable. And that wasn't the case with Peugeot's video.
Jonathan, I don't know if he'd like, I say this in love, and I have a lot of affection for Jonathan. I think Jonathan is a more radical Christian than he realizes.
I don't know if it's than he realizes. I think it's than a lot of other people realize. And I talked quite a bit about Jonathan in my question and answer today.
I think
yes, I think that might be true of you too. And there's always the possibility that it's true of me.
Did he just call John Vervaeke a Christian? You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be a confessed Christian to be used by God's Spirit. Just saying.
Well, that's funny.
You and your logos, John.
I've had. That's funny because I've had some Christians say that to me recently, and I want to receive it properly, because receiving statements like that, like your receptivity,
right,
matters as much as anything else.
Yeah, it's not exactly a trivial compliment, John.
No, it's not. And
okay. What's with the? It's not. He keeps mentioning the name, and part of in English prose, when you do that, you're using it for emphasis. And again, what he knows of John is John comes to the University of Toronto as, in some ways, a professor practitioner who uses Tai Chi, plays Tai Chi, throughout the pandemic, had things in meditation. And so it could be that in Jordan's mind, John is sort of over on that new age frontier while being an academic, and a little bit of poking there.
Old Taoist friend on the board.
I think that's what he's doing.
Border between old Taoist friend on the border between chaos and order.
Well, yes, right, and that's
yes.
But it's what I'm interested in is the possibility that. Well, perhaps, maybe we could, this ties it together. Maybe when people are seeing, I hope, people who know me and seen any of my videos know that I'm deeply respectful to religion. So I do not mean any disrespect in what I'm saying. I'm not trying to be pretentious. But people who claim to...
Sometimes he goes overboard. But I understand, because a lot of religious people are really thin-skinned and get defensive quickly. But I'll tell you this just by my personal experience. He's deeply respectful. He is not your enemy, okay? And I know a lot of people, because there's a course in Buddhism and cognitive science and Taoism, and he does his things with his hands. He is not your enemy, okay?
See the Spirit of Christ in me. I hope what they are referring to, because that's what I aspire to, is somebody who is trying to realize in both senses of the word. That goes back to what we were talking about transjectivity. It's both something that this is Nishitani's use of realize. It's both realize it in both senses of the word, something that's coming into my awareness with intelligibility and something that's being actualized in reality. I hope that I'm realizing the logos with other people.
Well, I think your effect on your students is evidence of that, John.
But
what do you think of your name, by the way? Just out of curiosity.
My last name?
No, your first name.
He just keeps poking him here.
John, gift from God. I don't know.
Is this Jordan the evangelist? Jordan has a church of one, and maybe he can bring Vervaeke into his church.
Don't have to go there.
Well,
we could go there. You know, my middle name is Berent, and it's Norwegian, and I've always been somewhat embarrassed about it. I'm going to say that publicly. I probably never admitted that to anyone, but because it was parodied as burnt, because that's B-E-R-N-T, that's how it's spelled, and so it was an object of mockery. But so I didn't look into it much. But it's Berent, and my great grandfather, after whom I am named, built a ship and sailed it to North America.
Wow! And
he was a remarkable inventor.
Given what this dude has done, I guess this doesn't surprise me.
He invented a potato harvester and built it in his own shop, and he raised my father. In any case, I had an Indian carver build my third floor, which you'll have to see sometime because it's quite spectacular. And
I would like that.
He built a totem of me, and I'm standing in the arms of a bear. And I didn't know that was the meaning of my name.
Oh, really?
Yes, really. That really happened. So, and people have been, describing my name to me on YouTube comments, and so that's where I got that information. So, who knows what's in a name? Jordan, Berent, Peterson.
John is my favorite gospel, if that means anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. In the beginning was the word.
Yeah, the logos.
That suits you.
I guess.
What do you make of this comment that the Spirit of Christ is manifesting itself in you? I mean, that's not something you come up and just say to someone on the street. It's like, if you take that seriously, how do you take it serious? Yeah, well, then how do you maintain yourself?
Well, the thing is, it's not just, it's people that I talk to on video, but it's also my girlfriend, who she's sort of officially an atheist, but she knows that I don't profess to be a Christian because I have a very ambivalent history with Christianity. But she said to me, I actually think you're
like the rest of the Western world, you mean?
Well, yeah, and I noticed that was coming out in your discussion with Jonathan, and there was, I had tremendous empathy with you.
You know what the most powerful takeaway for me was from my biblical series?
Which was what?
The meaning of the word Israel.
Wrestling with God.
We who wrestle with God. Yeah. We who struggle with God.
Yeah.
It's like, well, maybe that's the real.
I listen to this, Jordan, and I say there is grace. That if you wrestle with God and prevail, there's grace.
Christian spirit is, that's what that phrase implies, and that's the real Jewish spirit.
Yeah,
it's the wrestling, John. It's why is there that strange scene of the wrestling with the angel? Like, why would you possibly fight with God? And then you think, well, God, isn't that what I'm doing all the time?
And
isn't that what everybody's doing all the time?
He partially wins, though. That's what's even more mysterious.
And hurts you doing so.
Yeah, that's
the story. But isn't that the story?
He takes away. So again, I've told the story before in the videos. Jacob hears that his brother Esau, another famous story, who Jacob tricked and got the birthright from, is coming at him with 400 men. And so Jacob cowardly arranges his family in order of preference. Why don't you do this with your son? The sons that are way up at the hedge, those are the first ones Esau's going to kill. And then Jacob is all the way at the rear thinking, maybe after he kills my sons and takes their wives and children as their slaves and all of my flocks and all of my animals, all the way back to my favorite sons, and then me, he has a little hierarchy of value going on, Jacob has there, in fear that Esau is going to take him. It's at that point that he wrestles with God. It's at that point, and he struggles and you know, in a sense is prevailing over the angel. And Calvin in his commentary, you know, says with one hand God fights us, and with his other hand he gives us the strength to fight back with him. John Calvin's comments on that in his commentary on the book of Genesis are absolutely brilliant. But then, you know, release me, for the sun's coming up. What kind of angel is only out at night? And no, I won't release you till you bless me. Oh, wait for the blessing you're going to. So he touches his hip and he's lame. What is the one, and this whole story starts at Bethel, where Jacob, you know, God appears to Jacob in a dream, and there's Jacob's ladder, the stairway, the angels going up and down, and repeats basically the blessing that he had given to Abraham. And Jacob ends, hearing the blessing, ends it by saying, takes a blessing and turns it into a deal and says, well, I'll give you 10% if you follow through on that. But you don't understand what a gift is? It's like, I'm not taking your gift. I want to earn it. Oh, okay. And then Jacob struggles with Laban, struggles with Esau. And the one thing God takes away in that fight is Jacob's ability to run. And it is God saying to Jacob, now will you trust me?
I mean, it isn't belief. It's the wrestling with belief. And it's wrestling in the way that you're wrestling.
I do sparring, and I often use sparring as a metaphor for the kind of...
Oh, so that's the other metaphor for dialogue.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not just the tracking, it's the sparring.
Yeah, and we have to remember, you know...
I mean, that kind of sums up men's relationships.
Well, Plato
with each other, tracking and sparring.
Plato means big shoulders. He was a wrestler. That's his nickname. His nickname is Plato because he's a wrestler. And we have to remember that the Greeks are in the gymnasium even more than they are in the academy, right?
I was watching this Suits episode last night, and the men are always sparring with each other verbally, you know, and they're tracking something. They're tracking victory.
Again, it's not disconnected, but it's we want something more linear. Okay, it's shamanic.
In this series, they're philia.
You can shift off
and
that.
They wrestle when they fight. They have to go into a clinch and a fight to settle their disputes, like a physical fight.
But you can shift off of that. This happened, Bernardo and I, when we were doing this, we both said this. You can shift off of it, and this happens when you're actually martial arts sparring, because you get into the shared flow state. You can shift off of victory to the aesthetics of the dance. There's a beauty in that is an independent that's independent of victory, that you can come to appreciate for its own sake. Plato talks about this. He talks about this, the beauty, the eros that draws you into that's why
a dance.
Yeah, a dance, but it's a dance that draws you beyond yourself. Edus, education, right? To draw forth from you. And
so is that the battle with the adversary? Is that related to this is another very serious question, obviously. It's a question related to the book of Job.
I don't know, because I see parallels, you know, in Nietzsche's quote, you know, I hate Socrates. He's so close to me. I'm always fighting him, right? You can see both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard wrestling with Socrates. Kierkegaard said, I follow Jesus, but Socrates is my teacher. And he wrestles with Socrates all the way through. Everybody's wrestling with Socrates.
I follow Jesus, but Socrates is my teacher. So is that the statement of the West?
I think that...
I mean, that was your objection at the beginning of this talk, right? At least to some degree, because you said how influenced you were with Greece. You insisted on how influenced you were by Greece.
I think the West is the attempt if I had to try and summarize the West, what an audacious thing to try and do.
See, Ruck said that, because I asked him why Dionysius transformed into Christ, because we were answering simple questions too. And he said, well, Greece met Judaism.
Yeah, but Judaism.
Okay, I'm going to pause it here. I'm out of time for now. This is probably enough for this next commentary. We're right at the transition into John's belief in Christianity, trying to integrate agape and logos. Wow. So again, the more I get into this, the more I slow it down, the better Peterson looks in it, the more intentional this looks. And so we'll see. So I guess this is part 3. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment. The comments on this series have been fascinating.